Welcome to Turkey Trends, part of Ahwal podcast series. I'm Navana Mahmoud, and the topic today is about Turkey and NATO. On the background, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan have met President Biden for the first time in Brussels in the NATO meeting. And to discuss that today, after the meeting, it's a pleasure and honor to welcome Max Hoffman, the Director for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress. Max, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
So here we go. A lot of analysts have wrote several articles before the meeting, predicting outcomes, suggesting agenda and what should be discussed in the meeting. And everybody was looking forward to scrutinize the readout, but the readout wasn't published. What is your impression about how the meeting went on?
I think the meeting was fine, honestly. Despite all of the hype in advance, I think that most analysts really following things closely who at least have conversations with how the US anyway was thinking about approaching this first meeting between the presidents didn't expect too much. The Biden administration had pretty clearly signaled for the last 6 months, even 7 since he won the election, that their desire in the early stages with Turkey was to reestablish some distance between the presidents and return US-Turkish relations to the normal channels, the more bureaucratic channels. Because, as we all know, I think during the Trump years, the Trump-Erdoğan relationship had just gotten so highly personalized and chaotic and, largely outside the normal channels of US government action. And that was a problem and resulted in all sorts of chaotic decisions and rollouts. Northern Syria withdrawal, both of them are prime examples of that, but there are others. And so, hence the delay in the presidential phone call, the first phone call between the two men.
Correct.
And the very carefully staged, managed senior official contacts. But, I think the US side knew that the message was also that, the US is not happy with Turkey. Obviously, those disagreements are well known, and I'm sure we'll get into them.
Sure.
But there was an understanding that at some point the presidents would have to meet. And I think having that meeting on the sidelines of the NATO summit was, again, meant as a signal that, that this relationship right now, with all the political disagreements, is largely limited to that alliance and the, sort of military context therein. And so that's what we saw. And the Turkish side and the AKP press was very keen to portray this as a, big, yes, of course, a big meeting. I think Erdoğan is desperate for a win. He wants to get off on the right foot with the Biden administration. And he's right now in a conciliatory cycle, in my view, trying to kind of smooth things over, turn the temperature down abroad, largely to protect the economy, which is obviously in very poor shape. So, he got his photo op. Biden, I think, got what he wanted, which was just to get the meeting out of the way without fireworks and, kind of manage things along with Turkey. So I think the meeting went fine in some. And, there are 1 or 2 areas where the countries have interests that align. And I think that, Afghanistan, the cross-border assistance into Syria,
sure,
and perhaps Libya. But then there are a bunch of disagreements. And so this is a compartmentalized relationship now. And that's what we saw reflected in the meeting.
Right. I'm impressed with your generous assessment that it went fine, because it's a little bit of a low bar. Turkey is one of the oldest countries who joined NATO. In the 50s, Turkey had even some hostile policies towards certain countries in the Middle East to prove that it is the backbone, it's the borders, the strategic country for NATO. And its importance to NATO is its geography. But you was talking about separating the issues for Turkey and the US. I just want to press you again about, I understand the Turkey bit. Turkey is, or Erdogan bit, he is keen to show his country as part of the NATO. But let me ask you one question first. This is a man who bent out of his way to bash America in front of his fan club in Turkey. He accused America on several occasions of being part of the coup. In 2016, he demanded Fethullah Gulen handing to Turkey. He believed that Turkey have every right to have independent policy. So despite of that, don't you think it's a little bit surprising that he's still keen on NATO? Why Turkey is keen on NATO?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right that it's a very low bar. So when I say the meeting went fine, in years past,
cynical, sorry.
right, in years past, U.S.-Turkish presidential meeting, you'd hope for fruitful,
Right.
optimistic, forward-looking proposals. You'd look for more warmth, and mostly that was missing because, yeah, the relationship is really in a very bad place, as you outline. Certainly for about a decade, Erdoğan, or even a little longer, Erdoğan has rhetorically talked about the world is larger than five, trying to position Turkey as a strong, independent power in its own right. Not part of any Eastern Bloc, certainly, but not really a sort of just a member on the team of the Western team. It wants to be, Erdoğan wants Turkey to be its own team. And that was fine when it was rhetorical and when it was issues like, trying to craft expanding diplomatic contacts or trying to take larger roles in places like Somalia. I think the West largely and the United States largely welcome that. But really after the coup attempt in particular, but in part also due to the escalation in Syria, he began to act much more aggressively to pursue that goal of, a series of goals, but one of them being establishing Turkey as this big power in its own right. And that has really led to a lot of angst in the West and in the United States. But as to NATO, it's still very valuable to Turkey and to Erdoğan even. He wants to be able to do what he wants. And he wants independent relations with Russia, and he wants to be able to buy arms from wherever he feels, including Russia. But that NATO membership also protects him from Russia. It's a huge source of prestige for Turkey, huge source of military technology and know-how. And that's what kind of that actually helps Turkey have a seat at the table internationally. And so I think that he still values that membership, and hence the sort of the playing nice in Brussels this week.
Okay, I'm interested on the other side, just before we move on. Biden, you mentioned, again, that's very interesting remark, that Biden just is keen that he have to meet with Erdogan. All what he care about is that the meeting went okay without storm, and that was fine for him, if I got you right. How Biden, I understand that the meeting, if the leak is correct, that Erdogan still insisted on the S-400. He is not willing to change that 100%. Do you think Biden was surprised by that, content with that, or just postponing that argument or that debate to a further, let's not clash about that today?
Mm-hmm. The S-400 issue is completely unresolved. And no, the US, and I'm sure President Biden, is not happy about the status quo.
Sure.
This is a NATO ally who purchased a major weapon system from Russia at a time when Russia has, in the last 13 years, invaded two neighbors, intervened in Syria, is bombing schools and hospitals, is poisoning dissidents abroad, and of course, has launched cyber attacks and attacks to undermine elections throughout the West. So, Russia is an enemy for the United States, and the United States feels it should be an enemy for NATO. Right. And so that S-400 purchase is infuriating to US officials. But there has been a response. Turkey was ejected from the F-35 program, which is a major blow, both technologically and economically, because of the co-production in a number of Turkish companies involved in co-production, and the loss of a highly advanced fifth-generation fighter. And then there have been the CAATSA sanctions, which were not as serious as they could be, but can be escalated if Turkey, for example, buys another battery of S-400s. So, I think the feeling was, all right, well, we've responded to this. We don't really want to go further down this escalatory path because, again, the US doesn't want Turkey outside NATO or alienated completely, or certainly, sort of cooperating more closely with Russia. Mm-hmm. It wants to manage this and sort of try to resolve these issues eventually. But I think there's an understanding in the US government that Erdogan is very deeply committed to the S-400 right now. And they've just tried to make clear to Erdogan and the Turkish government that this is a big problem. It's not going away. And really, until he reconsiders that decision, or there's a change in government and the new government reconsiders it, it's going to be very difficult to rebuild US-Turkish relations to anything approaching what they were previously.
Okay. Well, now you mentioned that, dividing, let's see the positive side. The positive side is, if I understand it correct, is Afghanistan. That Turkey have offered to control the airport and maybe controlling Kabul, despite the Taliban rebuff of that offer. How do you see Afghanistan as an issue which can bring cooperation between Turkey and the United States? And I mean that not rhetorically and not in front of diplomats and journalists, but in reality. Can Turkey manage Afghanistan after the American withdrawal?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm not sure, on the overall picture in Afghanistan, I'm not really sure I'm qualified to say, but certainly the sort of conventional wisdom is that the NATO and US withdrawal is going to lead to a Taliban resurgence, and that the Afghan government is going to be hard pressed to hold them off and maintain control of the cities, and and that's a very dire picture if all of those sort of analyses are accurate. I do think that the US would like genuine cooperation with Turkey in Afghanistan, because the US doesn't want to see Afghanistan fall back into chaos, and particularly the Kabul airport, which is the essential piece for all of the diplomatic representation and all of the support to the Afghan government that will remain post-withdrawal. And so I do think that could be an area of real cooperation. The broader context in US-Turkish relations here, though, is that, like I said, the Biden administration, and they came in, they have a pretty clear idea. Many of these people are Obama administration officials returning to government. They have a very clear idea of who Erdoğan is, of how he operates, and the reason they're adopting this compartmentalized approach is because they don't really escalating further, slapping more sanctions on Turkey or trying to torpedo the Turkish economy to undermine Erdoğan. That's not something the US is interested in doing. They don't want to go down this road. Nobody in Washington wants a bigger fight with Turkey. But they also are not willing to concede on these issues like the S-400, like the democratic backsliding, like the support for the SDF in Syria, that are very important to the United States. And so, that leads to one sort of obvious approach, which is to just try to hold the line, cooperate where there is alignment, and speak out when you're unhappy on other issues. And that's what we've seen, I think, so far from the administration.
Who will fund the Turkish presence in Afghanistan? Well,
that is something that they're negotiating now, in addition to what level of air support, what level of enabler, like sort of military enablers and sustainment and supplies they'll receive. I don't view this as a done deal at all.
Right.
Though, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, did come out and say that the presidents agreed in principle that Turkey would do this and the US would support it. So I think that hints that the funding will be US and NATO funding. And the details of that are yet to emerge. We'll just have to wait and see. But that is one area of cooperation. Clearly, Erdoğan and the Turkish government are going to try to use that area of cooperation as leverage to secure a broader, concessions on other issues or some sort of grand bargain. The goal here is really, Erdoğan spent the last 5 years beginning in the wake of the coup attempt with the first intervention in Syria, and really escalating from there, and escalating dramatically in the Trump years, when Trump really didn't care what Turkey or Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or anybody else did regionally. And Erdoğan saw that, and I think took advantage and started sort of grabbing physical territory, staking aggressive claims, maritime claims, for example, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and really doing as he pleased. The economy now, though, is very weak. He's vulnerable there. He's very weak politically at home. There's a new US administration that cares about these issues again. And so he's in a bit of a conciliatory cycle, like I said at the start, to just lower the temperature. And he hopes that by using places like Afghanistan, potentially Libya, and saying, look, Turkey can be valuable, we're willing to cooperate on these issues, he'll sort of get people to forget about the rest of the stuff, and he can solidify and consolidate the gains that he perceives he's made over the last 5 years or so. And on the U.S. side, I think that it's an open question. This approach of kind of keeping Erdoğan at arm's length, trying to manage things along, just keep things on an even keel, that makes a lot of sense because Erdoğan could lose in 2023. But it also risks essentially signing off on everything that has been done in the last 5 years, 6 years, and that I think is the risk inherent in it. But to the Biden administration, with all these other huge problems like COVID, like Russia, like China, stability is very attractive. And if Erdoğan offers stability in exchange for sort of turning the blind eye to some things, that's tempting. I don't think that they'll go for it entirely, but that's, I think, the Turkish strategy here.
Right. You mentioned Libya. How would you see that Turkish presence? Clearly, Erdogan is adamant to maintain his troop in Libya. He might negotiate the militias, the Syrian mercenaries in Libya to move, but he, in every occasion, in every press conference, he insisted that his troops are legitimate in Libya. The question is, would you see NATO giving more legitimization for the Turkish presence and put the NATO helmet for the Turkish troop in Libya? A chance?
Well, it's a very good and difficult question. I mean, I think the U.S. No, I mean Libya is in a much better place now than it was a year ago.
Correct.
Or a year and a half ago, I guess.
Yeah.
When first the Haftar offensive looked like it was going to be a massacre, and then Turkey's intervention really did save the GNA, which at the time was the legitimate government recognized by the United States. Mm-hmm. The US policy at that time was totally chaotic because of President Trump, sort of calling up Haftar, totally confusing the actual US policy. But Turkey was the only country that was willing to put forces on the line. Now, I don't think anyone approved about the way they did it, taking Syrians, desperate Syrians, and sending them abroad as mercenaries. That's pretty similar to Russia's modus operandi of sending Wagner mercenaries to all these places. But the fact is that intervention did allow for the military conflict to stabilize with the country essentially divided. And thanks to the Berlin conferences, US, German, French, Italian, Turkish efforts, it has moved to a political process. Now, yes, I think Erdogan views Libya through a few lenses. At the time of the initial intervention, the Russians and the Assad regime were pushing into Idlib, and the fear was that millions more Syrian refugees could flee into Turkey. And I do think that the escalation in Libya was in part linked to trying to gain leverage against Russia to stop that offensive. But it was also about securing Turkish commercial interests long term. Turkey has, I believe, 16 billion in outstanding dollars in outstanding loans in Libya that they hope to recoup. They hope for post-war reconstruction contracts, and then also the maritime agreement that they extracted from the GNA in exchange for the military support, which lets them sort of contest the East Med with the Greeks. So there are a lot of different interests. I don't think Erdogan's going to give up on any of those, but equally, the GNA, in order to maintain this political process, there will need to be some sort of force opposing the Haftar Russian Emirati forces, mm-hmm. just to maintain that equilibrium and demonstrate to everybody that the political process is the only option. So if that's not Turkish forces, it has to be someone, and that's an open question, I think. Right. But so the West, I think, and the US in particular, would like to see all sides withdraw the foreign forces and have this be a Libyan process. That's not going to happen right away, I don't think. So there'll have to be some sort of stepped de-escalation from both sides. And frankly, it's an open question to me, the extent to which the US and the West should cooperate with Turkey to, if Turkey is going to withdraw forces, probably the West should want the Russians or the Emiratis or, Haftar's forces to step back in a comparable way. To secure this broader de-escalation. So that's, it's a very complicated picture, but it's an area where there could be cooperation between the US, Turkey, and the other Western allies if Turkey is willing to, Turkey can't just have total influence over Western Libya or over a unified Libya. Of course, that's not going to be acceptable to anybody, including and most importantly, the Libyans.
Right. Now, which bring me to the EastMed, as you mentioned, and it was clearly before the NATO summit that Erdogan went on charm offensive with Greece. The foreign minister was in Athens. They hugged and looked very happy together and agreed to keep the relationship cordial. Do you see this honeymoon last, or for NATO? And which bring me to my last question: how do you see this honeymoon of stability? Lame, not lame. Happy, friendly Turkey to the United States, to Greece, to other NATO allies. How long do you think this will last? Do you think that 2021 will be the stable, springy, peaceful relationship within NATO?
Well, I don't think it's much of a spring, frankly, because what we haven't had further escalation, and certainly in the East Med, the temperature has come down. But it seemed for a brief moment last summer as if Greece and Turkey could actually exchange, have a military conflict. So certainly it's a better place than then, again, like in Libya. But I don't think, I don't think the issue is resolved, of course. So Eddie, but this charm offensive you mentioned, I mean, it's sort of, people talked about Erdoğan coming to the summit with an olive branch, but he didn't really bring any concessions. I think that he may or may not make the deployment in Afghanistan, but that's sort of a matter of his interest. But he didn't give concessions on any of the issues of importance to the US and NATO. So it's largely a rhetorical charm offensive. That said, he has, and the Turkish government has made a pretty concerted effort. You saw the outreach to Egypt, Greece, you mentioned. Macron and Erdoğan had a cordial meeting, which is a big change from a year ago. So there is an effort to turn the temperature down, including in the East Med. I view this in the following way. I think that Erdoğan's calendar is driven entirely by his re-election. He's always been primarily focused on regime security and his own personal rule. And he knows that he's in deep trouble right now at home. He's trailing in all of the polls against all of the major contenders. The economy is a mess. And he knows that the only hope he has of getting an economic recovery is to keep things a bit on an even keel. So I think he's trying to do that and turn the temperature down, and hence this conciliatory sort of face. But if the economy does recover, in the run-up to his re-election, whether that's in 2023 or if he calls it a year early or something, at present, I don't think it's likely. He's very likely to re-escalate on all of these fronts, as he has previously. Before, I think 4 of the last 5 elections, he's escalated conflicts abroad, in addition to the repression at home, particularly against the Kurds. The reasons for that, well, I think that it rallies nationalist support around the AKP. There's very strong national sentiment that in a time of conflict, it's important for Turks to rally around the government, even if you don't like it. And so I think he'll play on that. It also raises big problems for the opposition coalition, because then parties like CHP and İYİ Party have to decide how they talk about the Kurdish issue. So, I think that he's likely to escalate again in the run-up to the election, and that I don't think Erdoğan has somehow fundamentally changed. His political pressures at home haven't fundamentally changed. And so I do think we'll see a return to this aggressive nationalist line in the run-up to the election. But for now, he's trying to save the economy and consolidate some of the gains he's made over the last 5 years.
Max Hoffman, thank you so much. And I agree with you. We certainly have a toned down temperature now, and let's hope that will last for a little bit to give all of us a breathing space. But we'll watch for the escalation again, and maybe you will be kind enough to join me when this escalation stage happen again, and we can talk more.
Well, I hope I'm wrong, and things stay calm. But I'd be happy.
In Turkey, there is never a dull moment under Erdogan, and for that, thank you so much. And I finish this episode of Turkey Trends. I hope you found it interesting, and joining me again for another episodes and podcast in the future. Thank you very much. This is Navana Mahmoud. Max, thank you so much.